Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's talk. We are talking about the Land of Shambhala project to begin with, and the Holistic Life series that we're running over the coming months to introduce the project. Dzokden, as some of you may know, has purchased 40 acres of land in order to build a spiritual paradise for all types of people to experience the life-changing qualities of the Kalachakra path. And as part of Rinpoche's vision, we bring together the teachings of Kalachakra, the sciences, and various wisdom traditions in one place, allowing sentient beings to have the opportunity to find harmony within their external environment, internal and enlightened reality. Land of Shambhala will be a space where people can connect and be present in the world that they're living in with greater vitality, love and purpose. We will offer a holistic program of Kalachakra, medicine, yoga, philosophy, astrology and many other sciences. The Holistic Life series of the Land of Shambhala, we will discuss and introduce experts in their respective fields. So in Buddhism, in the 6 yogas, psychology, astrology, Ayurveda, Tibetan and Chinese medicine, herbs, Feng Shui and Sache. And they'll discuss these sciences and how to integrate them into the vision of creating the golden age of peace and harmony in the world. So each month we will have guest experts in their respective fields, and today we kick off our first talk with Dr. Adrian Hekel, who will discuss the similarities of the Kalachakra path and psychology. So Dr. Adrian Hekel is a Western medical practitioner from Coffs Harbour, New South Wales, who specialises in psychological medicine and specifically trauma therapy. He's also a keen student of Tibetan Buddhism for almost 20 years and has been closely involved with Khentrul Rinpoche and the Tibetan Buddhist Rime Institute since 2003. So in this conversation, we'll discuss how the principles of Buddhism and modern psychology integrate and how we can explore our inner landscape through different lenses to live a more happier and holistic existence. So we welcome Dr. Adrian Hekel.
Thank you, Tanya. I'm very honoured and humbled to be here as part of this Holistic Life series of talks.
Perfect. So Dr. Adrian, may we start with, I guess, talking a little bit about your journey and background?
I guess the first thing I want to say is that I'm not an academic or a scholar, but I do have some experience, some practical experience working with people for quite a few years in the field of psychology and especially trauma healing. So it all began when I finished medical school. I wasn't really so happy with how much I was making a difference to people. I wound up spending some time in a rural place where I practiced general practice of family medicine, and I found that I was really, really powerless with so many things that people came through the door with. And so I remember one patient in particular, I'll call him Colin, and he was just so depressed. Every week that I saw him, he had a rash, he had a lung problem, so many different things. And I felt really like my hands were tied. And I loved working one-on-one with people. I loved the flexibility within my work, but I felt I really needed to learn more. So I learned about nutritional medicine, then I went on and learned a little bit about acupuncture, but still didn't feel like I got to the root. So a few years later, I really discovered this link between general health and trauma, or like our emotional well-being. And at the same time, I was really interested in Buddhism and spirituality. So it just emerged that these two interests kind of came together. And when I'm talking about trauma, there is a type of trauma which, is loss of life or limb, severe abuse, that type of trauma. But there's also another type of trauma that we sometimes call little t trauma, which is much more subtle. It's kind of like when we may have been shamed by a grade 3 school teacher, for example, or even as a baby when we were left to cry and our mother didn't hear our cry at that particular time, or we landed in hospital as a child and had a really bad experience. All of those events are lodged in our memory, lodged in our bodies, and may sometimes have a profound effect on our health later on in life. So I really realized that healing trauma and really dealing with emotional well-being was the primary condition when it came to my work. And medication, acupuncture, lots of other things, they were important, but really, really secondary. And I guess the last thing that I really learned was through this time, I had to do the same type of healing work on myself. And I realized, many things about myself when I was working with some of these people. Was I really there for the right reason? Did I do medicine because I really wanted to help people? Maybe I needed to prove myself. Or maybe I needed to feel needed. And so this journey has also included looking deep within, and through that I feel I have become slowly more available to really helping a broader range of people.
Lovely, thank you. So if we look at specifically the Kalachakra system now, the word itself literally means wheel of time, and in its essence is the nature of everything. So if we look at the system through the three different natures of reality, when we talk about the external, the internal, and the enlightened, and just briefly, the external reality being the nature of everything, everything existing within the cycles of time, and those constant cycles are changing through, the many galaxies, universes, and our world. So it's an endless cycle of change. And when we look at our internal reality, so we look at the level of beings inhabiting the universe, and on an individual level within ourselves, that's the structures of a person's body and mind, and the dynamic play of those, that body and mind that has the influence on the external world. And then we look at the enlightened reality, where we explore deeper through the very nature of reality, and we discover what is referred to as the pure form of Kalachakra. So can you say something about, I guess, how these three levels relate or may relate to psychology?
So first of all, when I first came across this Kalachakra framework for understanding reality, it really struck a chord in me, and it was like, wow, this penny dropped. What an awesome way to have this all-embracing framework looking at the outer and the enlightened levels. And just to kind of put a little bit of flavouring onto what you've said, Tanya, based on like a teaching on Kalachakra by Khentrul Rinpoche, when we look at Kalachakra literally meaning time and wheel, and we look at these three different levels, it's kind of useful in the context of talking about psychology to look at the outer level of constant change, which is time, and wheel, which is like the interconnectedness of everything in the universe undergoing that change. And then when we have a look at the inner level, this inner wheel of time, it's like this wheel is our response to this interconnection, which is profound love. And time we can relate to compassion, which is our response to seeing everything change, transform, die, decay. Our heart opens in this way on the inner level. At the basis for all of these levels, both the inner and the outer, is what we call time, what we could call timeless time, which is a little bit like how science talks about the quantum field. And the Kalachakra, they have this beautiful way of putting it. Bliss, which is the masculine aspect, and empty form, or sometimes they say things like infinite beauty, which is the feminine. It's really these three levels, I think it's so important, because they're not something like a theory. We can actually see them in practical terms, working with people, working in our everyday life. And in a way, I see my type of work is in trying to kind of harmonize these levels of the inner, the outer, and the enlightened levels, knowing that beyond the two outer levels, the inner and outer levels, there's this enlightened potential within everybody that is longing to be unveiled. And let's talk a bit about how this relates to psychology then. And I want to look at this a little bit historically, because what we can see is this kind of progression where in psychology we're kind of beginning with the outer layers and then working gradually towards this enlightened level. So in the beginning of the turn of the century, two really important figures emerged, Freud and Jung, and they really started to put psychology on the map. And they really discovered that beneath our conscious reality was what they term the subconscious, which is kind of like an iceberg. So you can see just a little bit floating above the surface, but by and large, 90% of it is hidden from this awareness. It's what they also call the shadow. And this shadow, especially according to Freud, was dominated by the forces of instinct and gave rise to all kinds of kind of mental conditions, diseases at that time. Yet he also was saying that kinds of this all began when we were born, which was kind of like a blank slate. So childhood experience had a lot of mapping what was in the subconscious. And then Jung came along and he talked about the subconscious in terms of different tendencies, like some people prefer thinking, intuition, feeling, or sensing. And then he extended this to what we call the collective unconscious, the forces which shape how our cultures and societies evolve. And when we look at the outer Kalachakra, the thing which I find fascinating is this, this idea of this collective unconscious as being responsible for how our reality unfolds, this collective evolution of what they call 6 realms in Kalachakra Buddhism, related to intellect and thinking being dominant, or kind of sensing and comfort and fear as in the animal realm and other realms as well. And then we also have, on an inner level, we have this increased insight into how our behaviour kind of comes about through these subconscious forces. And then in psychology later on, we have this link between the physical level and the mental level. And this really is what made psychology really scientific. And we had pioneers like Skinner and Pavlov do a lot of experiments talking about behaviorism and behavior activation. And for example, if we hear a song and it all of a sudden brings back a flood of emotions from a long time ago when we heard that song before, that's like a form of conditioning. And similarly, they describe something called reinforcement, where rewards cause us to kind of do the same actions again and again keep certain things. So then this behaviour aspect evolved into this new wave called cognitive psychology, which realised the limitation in just looking at behaviour, which was just a little bit too materialistic. And what this new wave was all about was to look at thinking in particular. So when we're depressed or anxious, for example, what are we telling ourselves that fuel these feelings? And we really discovered in this way the power of analysing reality and developing a clearer perception. And this is very much related to how I see this clearer understanding of reality in that just to give some context, I had a client recently who was a pro surfer and an artist, and he was an amazing father. Yet something happened to trigger him, and he was really depressed. He thought he was a failure, and yet through really carefully analysing what he's telling himself, thinking in black and white, fortune telling, reasoning with his emotions, filtering out the positive, thinking that things should be a certain way, having too many expectations. And we really are able to kind of look at thinking in this way, look at the evidence for how real, for what is going on inside him. And then very, very suddenly he was able to change. So then after the cognitive wave, there's this big movement which I think began in the 1960s approximately towards what we call mindfulness. So instead of being around how we think, it was more about the context in which this took place, that being able to notice feelings, sensations, memories, everything as they are arising, and being able to just witness this. The guy who started a lot of this was a beautiful man, Jon Kabat-Zinn, who came up with a program called mindfulness-based stress reduction, which carried a lot of inspiration from Theravada Buddhism, and to really put mindfulness in psychology. But then, especially in the last 10 or 15 years, it was apparent that mindfulness wasn't enough. And really, a lot of people from our culture needed not just mindfulness, but a loving acceptance of their reality, what we call mindful self-compassion. And this also includes connecting to our common humanity and its struggles, and developing new habits, really being kind to ourselves. So this added this loving awareness to our experience, which was a real amazing complement to mindfulness.
Sorry to interrupt you there, Adrian. I'm wondering if you can turn up your mic a little bit for everyone. Just a little quiet, please.
So I might move a bit closer. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So then we have a progression from mindfulness to looking at our experience in terms of not just thoughts, feelings, or whatever was arising, but realizing that within our experience, there's all kinds of inner conflict. Like there's these sub-personalities or sub-minds within each of us. Like part of us saying, go for it. Part of us saying, don't do it. I want to do this, I can't do it. And then we discovered that this world was opening up for people with all these inner players, so to speak. And we could then be mindful of these inner players, not just noticing them, but actually wanting to get to know them, to really hear what they were feeling, what they were needing, and what their role was. And just to give an example of this, I saw a person recently, and And he suffered a lot of anxiety, which he felt as this tight constriction around his heart area. And when he really got to know that a bit better, it was kind of like he was speaking to this part of him that needed to act really, really hyper-vigilant and anxious because it just carried this programming that it needed to be this way to protect him from pain. And when we really got to know this part, it reveals that there was a much younger part of him that had been really hurt by his father many, many years ago. And he actually started crying when he started to really listen to and appreciate what this part was trying to do, that this part was actually trying to protect him. So he didn't have to fight with it any bit longer. He could just be with it, understand it, and allow it to lead him towards healing this younger part which came up. And again, with Kalachakra, we're getting increasingly more and more insight into this interdependent inner level. And the other thing about this internal family systems approach is this amazing discovery that when we invite all of these parts within us to step aside, to clear the space so that we can really get to know one of these parts from a more open space, we discover an aspect inside everyone which is unconditionally compassionate and accepting and kind, and also an active agent in our healing. And they call this self-energy. And to me, this is very much similar to, in Kalachakra, what we call the enlightened reality. And then the final thing in the evolution of psychology, which I want to talk about, is what they call positive psychology. This wave, which first began with guys like Maslow and Carl Rogers, who really thought that we should be focusing more on fulfilling our human potential. And this has really boomed with a lot of research recently, especially by a guy called Martin Seligman, who speaks about these different dimensions to happiness: moment-to-moment emotion, positive emotion, engagement, and meaning, and positive relationships. And there's all these interventions they've researched, like, for example, and I also did this with one of my patients recently. If we think about someone who we haven't spoken to for a long time, but we really know that we kind of appreciate them, and we write down like a letter of things that we really, really want to say to convey that appreciation, and then read them that letter, then that's magic. That's amazing. We will just feel a buzz. Our happiness improves. And this is where this level of what we call positive psychology is really supporting discovering our strengths, discovering the power of altruism and love and compassion, this inner level leading to this enlightened level.
Perfect. Thank you for the history there, Dr. Adrian. So as we look at, I guess, some of the different aspects of Kalachakra, where have you seen them show up in modern psychology from your, your background and experience?
Yeah, so I guess I'm covering something very similar to what I've spoken about just before, except for this time we're going to look at the aspects of Kalachakra and relate them to different aspects of psychology. So first, in Kalachakra, we have the enlightened nature. Sometimes they call it the perfect nature. Mm-hmm. And really, this is the view that deep down, our deepest nature is perfect, complete, unchanged, and infinitely wise and compassionate and also not something passive, not like a witness or an escape, but actively manifesting in service to others. And to me, this is very similar in this internal family systems approach, and also mindful self-compassion, this part of us that can that we discover when all the distorted aspects are kind of able to be left to the side. There's part of us that emerges which is confident, calm, creative, clear, courageous, connected, and also compassionate. And this is really echoes this idea in Kalachakra that this is what gets revealed when all things obscuring it are made to step aside. Just like we can get a glimpse of the sun on a cloudy day when the clouds part. Very, very similar. And we can also kind of look at touching this perfect nature, I guess, when we really, really deeply challenge distorted thinking patterns of bias, which is quite similar in my mind to what they do with reasoning in Buddhism, such as what they call Madhyamika. And also there's another field of psychology called transpersonal psychology, where they purposely intervene to shut off the thinking mind, for example, by manipulating brain waves or certain breathwork techniques or with certain substances. And that also leads us to this state of transcendence, the state of oneness, we can say, which is similar to this enlightened reality, and which is also a little bit similar to, in quantum physics, what they call this field, which is not empty but full of energy, full of potential.
Mm-hmm.
So then there's this second, there's one more thing to add to that too, with this enlightened aspect. In kinds of psychology, for example, internal family view, there's this enlightened aspect of ourselves, but then there's a sense of bringing this into these different parts. So there's still kind of a little bit of separation, or in many areas of spirituality, there's this sense of this enlightened reality, and then we have to bring it into our body. A little bit of separation. But I guess one thing that I love about the Kalachakra view is it begins with this notion that even all of our parts are part of this fully integrated enlightened reality where everything is already pure and we just need to unveil this. And that's a little similar in this internal family systems view of when we work with these different parts of ourselves and allow them to let go of the burdens that they may have been carrying for many years, perhaps many lifetimes. We discover this pure aspect which is actually integrated with self-energy. And for me, that's a little bit reminiscent of in Kalachakra, where we describe our experience as a mandala, where there's the oneness of this enlightened reality manifest many, many hundreds of deities which have profound significance. So the next thing about Kalachakra that I'm going to talk about is this inner reality, or this understanding of interdependence, which manifests as this connection and the sense of responding with love and compassion. So this enlightened reality, it's possible for people to glimpse it, but it's really hard to stay there. And that's why, like, we speak about these layers of what we call relative truth or conditioning, which we work with in order to come closer to this enlightened reality. And in psychology, so much of it is about gaining not just intellectual insight, but experiential insight into how our experience has been conditioned. For example, there's a patient of mine who has a lot of trouble blaming her mum for like an upbringing which was really, really tough. Yet, in really going inside and being with not just her struggles, but some of the struggles that her mum may have endured, and appreciating a felt sense of what may have happened to her, how she may have inherited through generations, through her ancestors, how she is the way she is, then we see things more clearly. There's more appreciation of this interdependent origination of how we come to see the world right now. And also, like, when anger emerges, obviously it's not just our mum, it's also other things that happen in our life that feeds that anger. And it really allows us to build that love and compassion, or in mindful self-compassion, they would say, be our own best friend and nurture our positive qualities and strengths, and have a sense of gratitude rather than being fixed on bias and emotions which may be destructive or harmful. Mm-hmm. The third aspect of Kalachakra, which I think is quite beautiful and unique, is this all-embracing, non-biased view. So in the Tibetan tradition, or in other traditions too, there's a lot of deities with a particular kind of job or purpose. Like wisdom, we represent Bananjushi, for example. The feminine loving nature is embodied by the goddess Tara, and the ferocious feminine, we could say, is embodied by, for example, the Hindu goddess Kali. Yet Kalachakra, it's unique in that it embraces everything. It's the most colourful of all deities, and it has 4 faces, which kind of are linked to these, bringing together these all different races, different religions, different people, different culture, different ages, different lifestyles, and really seeing the unity within diversity. And it's not to say, everybody needs to practice Kalachakra and so we can discover oneness. It's not like that. It's kind of like this unity within appreciating diversity, that different people, the different medicines, which can help them. And when we can all appreciate that, then that leads to less conflict, less bias, and we can really look at this common ground and work together to create an authentic future which isn't weighed down by this bias. And in psychology, there's so many things that have evolved, and I really see them as different medicines that suit different people, depending on their needs and where they're coming from. So the 4th aspect of Kalachakra, I'm going to talk about, perhaps the most interesting, is this understanding of energy. So when we tune into our inner body, we can feel these, what we may call energy currents, if we really tune in, these subtle sensations. Some of them may be constrictive, some of them may be freely flowing, but it's what we call these subtle winds, which circulate the body in a constant flow. And one of the really interesting things about Kalachakra is how it describes the circulation of this energy system through time. So, for example, every 2 hours there's a cycle where it's more on the left side of our body or the right side. There's this constant kind of alternation, this dissolution and emergence. And for example, when the energies are about to change from one side to another, that's when we can feel most centered, most aligned, and also find it easiest to meditate. And in Western neuroscience, which supports psychology, there's a lot of research into the left and right brain and the cycles between left brain and right brain. So the left brain is to do more so with moving onwards, going somewhere, and perhaps being a little bit intellectual. The right brain is more kind of let's press pause, and also associated with creativity, and it's also where a lot of trauma may be stored, we can say. And so there's this constant kind of balance that in the West we've also discovered alternates in these particular rhythms, and our hormones also alternate in these particular rhythms every 2 hours. And if you kind of notice how you're breathing at the moment, you take a breath in through both of your nostrils, you'll probably notice that one nostril is easier to breathe through than the other. And that's an example of like these energies flowing more towards one side than the other. So the left side of the body, the right brain, the right side, the left brain. Interestingly, in the West, we're actually using this advantage. For example, we know that when people are depressed, it's kind of like they're stuck in the right brain a little bit too much, and we can actually use magnetic pulses in a particular area in the front of the left brain, something called TMS, is a very powerful way to often cure depression. So here we're looking at this amazing aspect of Kalachakra, which describes the movement of energies. And in the West, we talk about integrating energies: left brain, right brain, front brain, mid brain, hind brain, which means integrating our thinking, our feeling, and our sensing. And all of this integration we can also feel in our body, integrating our head, our heart, our instincts. And in Kalachakra, all of this is very, very beautifully and profoundly described in practices where we are able to balance the different energies, the masculine and feminine energies in different areas of the body, especially if we're able to visualize the mandala with all these different levels and different deities. They have a profound balancing effect. And the other interesting thing in Kalachakra is this correlation between these internal energies and aspects of what happens in the outer universe. For example, when there's an eclipse, a solar or a lunar eclipse, it's much more likely that our energies are aligned and in the center, so that our nostrils aren't on one side or the other. And even the lunar cycle, there's a sense that, sometimes when it's full moon, people go a bit crazy, or there's vivid dreams, and we can actually correspond this time of the full moon with the energy being centered at the crown of the head. And then through the lunar cycle, it travels down the right side of the body, and after the moon, it travels back up through the left side of the body. So it's such a profound system, and I think holds great promise for dialoguing with science, especially neuroscience and psychology, in order to understand this more deeply.
Thank you, Dr. Adrian. So within the field of psychology, you have particular interest in the methods to heal trauma and how this can be integrated with spirituality because of your background. Can you talk a little bit more about this?
Yeah, so I'm really, really interested in trauma because I just think it's so important. We used to think that talking about trauma, just listening with empathy to people who've been through trauma was enough, and then simply time would heal these wounds. But what we're discovering is this really isn't the case. And that's why I'm so called to reach out to like a lot of these people who go through this living hell with these traumatic experiences recurring again and again. And if I just have a little bit of a talk about what happens in trauma, it's kind of like there's part of our nervous system that's frozen in time. So if you imagine an insect that's frozen in amber, it's a little bit like that. There's a part of our brain where these memories are kind of frozen, which correspond to parts of our body where we feel that energies are frozen, like a knot in our stomach or a constriction around our heart, for example. And then I guess there's a question, can we do anything about this? And there's been kind of this almost revolution in understanding trauma, understanding how we need more than just talking about it to help people become free of trauma. And we talk about this approach to trauma healing with these three phases: becoming more stable, stabilization, by connecting with different resources. And that's where spirituality really comes in. If we have spiritual resources, if we can bring in connections with spiritual figures or guides or any sorts of inspiration or any sort of practices, then that stabilizing can be so powerful.
And this is probably a great point, Adrian, that a lot of people feel that it's all or nothing, like you have your spirituality and you can't do anything else, or you have your treatment and you can't do anything else. So it's really an integrated approach.
Yeah, and that's such an important point. Sometimes I see it as like two wings of a bird, because if it's just focused on spirituality without dealing with trauma, then sometimes we get frustrated because we can't really see that much progress. But then if we just focus on trauma without any spirituality, we might miss it quite a lot. So then in trauma healing, there's stabilizing, and then there's this really amazing discovery, something that we call reprocessing, which is kind of repertoire of techniques which can actually help us permanently move from the state of fight, flight, or freeze, which trauma locks us into a state of being able to move past it and say, I'm a survivor, I got through this, I'm okay, I'm safe. And what we call this is memory reconsolidation. So what happens is we get into a state where we can feel calm, stable, present, and grounded, and full of what we call self-energy. There's part of us which can be really a compassionate witness. And from this place of self-energy, then we can be there with those parts of us that may have endured the trauma and really listen to and witness their untold story. Just being with them, like with their parent, being with them, not just witnessing what happened, but then inviting them to visualize or envisage a new reality where they could imagine that things were different. So we can't obviously change what happened, but we do have a window in which we can really heal what happened. And then these parts that were wounded really do start to shift. And this can happen with just by witnessing on its own. It can happen with, there's other techniques that use tapping, there's other techniques that use body movements or eye movements. For example, if I imagine being in a trauma situation and then follow my fingers from side to side, that can be a very powerful way of neutralizing those traumatic memories. And shifting how we think and feel and believe about them.
Mm-hmm. So a couple of follow-up questions for you, Dr. Adrian. So if someone is able to heal trauma, then what? And also, are all people with trauma able to heal?
Yeah, so both really, really good questions. So sometimes, well, what I might do is just talk a little bit about, just to give this a little bit more context, talk a little bit about an example of how we may work somebody with trauma, which is something that maybe we can all relate to. So when, there's something really triggering and we just go straight to the fridge and just binge on whatever we can give us comfort. For me, it's chocolate. For other people, it's different things, of course. And then, we feel, oh my God, what have I done? I ate a whole block of chocolate in 5 minutes. There's this sense of, I'm not going to do that again. I'm going to control this. I'm going to manage this. So there's the reactive part, and then there's this controlling, managing part. And then, the cycle may happen again the next time we're triggered. So what we can really do is get to know these parts that get triggered in this way, really get some insight into, by reacting in this way, by controlling in this way, who or what are they trying to protect? And often that leads us back to these kind of younger child parts that may have been hurt in some way. May, for example, have used food as comfort when they were really hurt by a dad who wasn't around for them, for example. And, when we do this, that gives us that way in to be able to really heal this trauma through this reparenting and unburdening process, which I spoke about before. And then when we can heal this trauma, then these different parts then start to shift. So there's no reason for that reactive habit to be there. There's no reason for that controlling, managing habit to be there. So those parts can soften and relax and kind of change their roles, update their descriptions. So then, we get to this point with some people where, neutralize this impact of trauma. And then what? Sometimes people come out of, especially severe trauma, just feeling a little bit neutral. And that's where, especially with the tools of positive psychology and connecting to values, connecting to what's really meaningful, that can be of really good service to people. And also, I think when we've healed some really big trauma, that can also be a really good place to enter a spiritual path really authentically. And just to give one example too, something else that may happen may be that when we kind of release our trauma, then these previously hidden good qualities just naturally start to emerge, like a light being switched on for a short time. And that may kind of organically change where a person is, but what their role is, what their mission is in life. And for example, I had a patient who healed from some quite big trauma, and he was in a job that he didn't really like. I think it was sterilizing medical equipment, and he was also doing some study in nursing. And he decided, that's it, I'm going to quit my job. I'm also going to quit my study. And during this time, he was supported. Like, his relationship with his wife was much better, and they could really get by. And he had this passion for basketball, for jiu-jitsu, and for helping young people. So now he's on the road to creating his vision for helping young people in this way, which is really where his deepest heart is leading him, rather than just doing things to get by or make other people happy. Mm-hmm. So then the other question, are all people able to heal trauma? And yeah, it's such a delicate question, because Ultimately, I think yes, but then in a practical sense, and I know this through experience, it really depends on someone's capacity. So in some people, what I've talked about may be a really smooth process. Other people may need that little bit of extra help. Some may need medication, herbs, vitamins, hospital stays. Some may need intensive support, like joining group programs, for example. And just, I guess from my experience, if a person has like some kind of spiritual community or sangha or church, I just find that they often do so much better. And there's so many different medicines out there for different people. So I encourage, if any people out there are struggling, there's always hope. Never give up searching, because if that intention is there to really heal, then one day you can have confidence there will be the right medicine out there.
Thank you. So if we look specifically now how psychology relates to the principles of the Kalachakra Nondro. So in Kalachakra and many other Tibetan Buddhist schools, there's a sequence of preliminary practices known as the Nondro, which in a spiritual path is a skillful way to purify negativity, enhance your compassion, and develop a calm and clear mind. Is there anything similar to this from what you've witnessed in modern psychology?
Yeah, so this was something I really stumbled across in my own experience, first of all, because I've had a few years of practicing these very powerful preliminary practices. And then I learned some of these trauma healing modalities, and then I realized there's actually quite an incredible overlap. And it's that kind of nurtured a seed in me to really look at kind of bringing these together a little bit, because psychology and trauma healing, they use a language which is often very easily understood by anyone. And just in the same way as these preliminary practices work with this powerful and specific sequence practices to really lead us to this enlightened reality. It's something very similar in trauma work called resourcing, where we kind of look at different practices, different techniques like breathing, like visualizing, maybe tapping or particular body movements, different type of visuals, all in a specific sequence. And it's a little bit like you've got an orchestra of different instruments playing music together. Every particular technique in this sequence has a really amazing role to lead us to connecting with that part of us that's stable, clear, compassionate, and is able to go in and heal this trauma like we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm. So if we break this down a little bit, when we talk about the sequence of the preliminaries and the Nondro practice in the Kalachakra system, we start with the four thoughts that turn the mind towards the Dharma. So reflecting on the preciousness of our existence, the impermanence of all things, the suffering that exists, and leading us to, I guess, renounce behaviours that lead to greater suffering. And finally, the understanding of karma, which is how our actions directly are responsible for what happens to us. So is there something similar to that in what you've seen in modern psychology?
Well, I guess for people, especially who've endured trauma, suffering is really there every day in our face. We don't have to go looking for it. And we can see how conditioning, which is kind of similar to karma, keeps on perpetuating this experience of being triggered and falling into what we call the trauma vortex again and again and again. And then when we kind of have hope that we've discovered something and this can actually work, it's like, wow, there's this precious opportunity to do this inner work myself, this precious opportunity to, as quickly as I can, be free of this cycle of conditioning, which we call the trauma vortex.
And then once we've sort of we've contemplated on those 4 thoughts, we look at refuge. So we're left with that, that sense of fear and I guess that want or that willingness to be liberated from suffering. And we take refuge in the exemplary objects before us, known as the 3 jewels. Is that translatable as well?
So in trauma healing, in people who with trauma, they find it very difficult to feel safe, and they find it very difficult to feel this innate sense of connection. So this principle of refuge, I think, is very, very important. And what we do, for example, to help people get that sense of refuge is and protection from fear, is to visualize something like a safe, sacred place, usually somewhere in nature where they can open up to what they see, hear, touch, opening up to all the senses. And then, we can extend that by building in a visual connection to what resonates with them, what they see as being a figure or figures that can, or team of helpers, we could say. We sometimes use that language to really be with them and give them support as they go through this trauma healing process. Sometimes we speak, for example, of power animals like a powerful lion or a bear or an eagle, or sometimes we can invoke spiritual figures like angels, wherever someone's coming from, and that can provide this sense of attunement, which a sense of love and compassion, which may be difficult to just get from within ourselves. And there's this exercise we sometimes do where we facilitate people with this attachment figure in front of us, looking into their eyes, feeling their heart, breathing together, sensing them touch you. And that's something which can be very, very powerful resource, very, very powerful refuge.
Mm-hmm. And similar to bodhicitta, I guess, as you've described there, when you generate that immense compassion, that love, that sense of interconnectedness with ourselves, but also all beings in samsara as well.
Yeah, so with this idea of bodhicitta, we often speak of warrior compassion. And in psychology, there's this real kind of amazing movement towards facilitating this notion of self-compassion, being with ourselves in a nurturing, loving and courageous way, having the courage to go into our psyches and heal and be with and listen to with love those parts of ourselves that have been really, really hurt. And not only ourselves, but those parts of us which may be related to our ancestors, may be related to other people in our lives, may be related to collective conditioning. So what we'd say is that, like, this emphasis on self-compassion and healing what goes on inside of us is like this amazing bridge which can then allow us to be not only internal bodhisattvas, but bodhisattvas who are really out there in the world of service in whatever way we're called to give that service.
Mm-hmm. And then with the preliminaries, we look at the Vajrasattva practice, which is it gives us a space to connect with our Buddha nature, which is currently hidden by defilements, but it gives us, a practice to clear or clean those defilements to be able to uncover this perfect Buddha nature. Is there anything like that as well?
Yeah. So in trauma healing, especially the internal family systems approach, which I've spoken about a bit, we speak about connecting with our innate purity. It's how it's about facilitating these parts of us to step aside so that we can glimpse our innate purity, about facilitating the healing and letting go of burdens that these parts of us may carry, which may have been affected by shame, which may have been affected by fear, anger. When we are able to really be with those parts and allow them to let go of their burdens, then this innate purity shines through. Then these parts take on new roles. Then we kind of discover this light within, which isn't obscured as it may have used to be.
Mm-hmm. And then we come to mandala offering, where we have that sense there's nothing more important than us uncovering our own truth. So we need these vast positive offerings, with the best motivation to accumulate the merit to be able to do this.
Yeah, so there's a lot, especially in positive psychology, about the power of gratitude, generosity, altruism, and ways to really enhance this. And way to enhance this giving and letting go, because ultimately it's all about letting go in order to surrender to what we may call a higher power. And in what we do in practice in Buddhism is this really profound practice, which may look a little quirky to people who haven't come across it before, where we kind of visualize these 4 continents and all that we can possibly imagine as an offering in front of us, to our right, to our left, behind us, expand into infinity. This also gives us a lot of space, a lot of clarity, and that's something, this idea of expanding to the infinite, which we sometimes use to enhance that connection to self in psychology.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. And then we come to Guru Yoga, which is, the practice of unifying your mind with the mind of the Holy Guru and being aware of that interconnectedness and that oneness, to allow and to receive the stream of blessings. Is there anything like that?
Yeah, so I'll begin by kind of talking a little bit about some of the teachings from Khentrul Rinpoche, where he talks about this importance of seeing this relationship with the Guru as having a foundation in ordinary relationships. So it's kind of like when we look at relationship, it's such a powerful way if we kind of have respect, devotion, and unconditional love to somebody. It's such a powerful way to benefit ourselves. It's not for the other person so much as for ourselves. And so then we have this idea of opening to the power of a sacred relationship, where it's not about being possessive, it's not about adhering to cultures or conventions, it's about developing the purity of our perception. And if something happens and we're triggered, we're really pushed in that direction of looking inside of us. What is it within us that needs to be healed so that we can be in this relationship in more of a sacred and full way? And when we spoke about this idea of refuge and connecting to some kind of attachment figure or spiritual figure, with Guru Yoga, what I kind of can convey is that we're kind of extending this to imagine that this figure is the embodiment of someone really, really special in our lives. So that sense of connection, when it's personal, just does something to make our heart open. And I think both in like ordinary relationships, to kind of really enhance our level of fulfillment and happiness, and in spiritual relationships, that really is a bridge to really developing something quite special. And of course, in the Tibetan tradition, Guru Yoga is all about developing this bridge to discovering our enlightened nature. And I think we can also relate that to ordinary relationships as well.
Perfect, thank you. I might take this opportunity to ask the audience if they do have any questions that they would like to pop into the Q&A section if you're in Zoom, in the Facebook chat if you are joining us on Facebook. And whilst we are waiting for your questions, I guess in conclusion, Dr. Adrian, what do you think Buddhism could learn from psychology, and what do you think psychology could learn from Buddhism?
So the first thing about psychology, as it has evolved in these different ways, which I talked about at the beginning, is that it's evolved in our particular cultural context, and with that comes a language. I feel if we as in Buddhism or in spirituality in general can adopt some of this language, it can really make things more practical, more relatable to a wider type of audience. And also the way psychology has evolved, it's evolved in such a way to be very amenable to scientific research. And I think that's something which could be very powerful if we extended that more to Buddhism and spirituality. And I guess when I mention this idea of language, I think one phrase or one term in particular comes to mind, this notion of integration. And like in spirituality, we often talk about things like enlightenment, which may seem a little bit inaccessible to some people, but if we talk about integration versus being fragmented, we can consider integration perhaps to embrace every part of ourselves, integrating, as in the Kalachakra, all the energies within ourselves, integrating our own experience with everything that's going on in this connected universe. Then that may be something that people can relate to really well. So the other thing in psychology, which I think is absolutely crucial, is if we have some understanding of the principles of our subconscious, our shadow, that can be very, very important to help guard against what we call spiritual bypassing, which is kind of like when we use spirituality as kind of an escape, we could say, where, we do our mantras, practice, but we may not completely be heading in the right direction. And to other people, we may appear a little bit, aloof or a little bit disconnected. So some of these psychology principles can really bring us back, I feel, to this practical reality of our day-to-day lives, which is such a crucial starting point for all of us. And the other thing is really, which I've talked about a lot in this talk, is this emphasis on self-compassion. So in our culture, and this is something I think in one of the conversations with the Dalai Lama, he was really horrified to hear that in our culture, people can actually hate themselves that people lack self-love, because in Tibet it's just such a given that it's just there. So this emphasis on self-compassion, I think, is so relevant to what is happening in our culture, and such a crucial starting point to being able to extend this compassion to others. And I feel that when we have self-compassion and engage in this process of healing our internal parts, then we're much better equipped to really be there in service of others, as Buddhism so powerfully talks about. And the other thing is how Buddhism can help psychology. So I guess the first thing is, we heal our trauma, we do all our inner work. It's like, then what? Is that all there is to life? And Buddhism really gives us this vaster view of this path to unveiling enlightenment. And it's something which sometimes a lot of people kind of tend to kind of just not even consider, or think, wow, that's just way too big, that's too much. Yet it could be so powerful if we're really able to embrace that more and more through research, through really going into what records there are about centuries and centuries of exploration of inner reality with these great masters in Tibet and other forms of spirituality too. And if we could be scientific about that, then that would really, really help our planet, I feel. And I guess the other thing is ideas like looking at trauma and conditioning, not just in terms of what happens in this life, but over many, many lives, kind of expanding our view as to what healing actually is. And the other thing that I think we can learn from Buddhism is the importance of Sangha, the importance of spiritual community really supporting the healing process. Because in psychology, it's often all about, let's be confidential and just have a one-on-one relationship with our therapist, perhaps. And the thought of really being open, honest, and vulnerable in a group may be a little bit daunting for some people, but I feel that this idea of Sangha can be so important in this respect. And I guess the last thing with Kalachakra in particular, we have this vision of immense hope for what's going on, what will go on in future years on our planet. So it's not just about individual healing, but it's also about collective healing. There's this idea or vision of a golden age and how we can be responsible to not just heal ourselves, but be part of collective transformation.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Adrian. We do have a couple of questions. So can the quality of forgiveness play a role in trauma healing? I mean, we don't need to forget the trauma, but to forgive.
Yeah, so absolutely. So alongside compassion, alongside a real accepting view of whatever goes on, forgiveness can very much spring forth from that. And what they say is that forgiveness can be extraordinarily powerful as a way of healing trauma, or as a component of healing trauma. But it actually, this is what some of these people who practice psychology say: forgiveness isn't always absolutely necessary. So you can still heal trauma and have respect for this person, really feel that they're kind of a human being and deserving of some compassion, yet still hold a little bit of reservation to making that step for forgiveness, one can still heal one's own trauma in doing that. But if we can really open our heart to forgiveness, that can certainly be even more powerful, I feel.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So we look at, this is a specific Guru Yoga question. A psychological equivalent may be for someone extremely isolated and traumatized, perhaps encouraging that person to develop devotion and service towards their pet, say a cat or a dog. What would you say to that?
Absolutely. I actually remember teaching from Khentrul Rinpoche once about, I think it was about Vajrasattva, and he was talking about, okay, you can make this connection of Vajrasattva to someone special in your life. It can be your guru or it could be your dog. So as long as we've got that heartfelt connection to something, the only kind of caveat on that is that sometimes with using a pet, for example, if we've had previous experiences where we may have lost a pet, or we've really, really loved an animal to bits and then they've died, that may kind of be a little bit challenging, because we may not feel that immense connection which we may otherwise feel, because it may be a little bit tainted. But in essence, if we can look at the core, the spirit, or the essence of that animal that we connected to, and use that as an object of refuge, then by all means I think that it can be a beautiful practice.
Thank you. And I think this is our final question. Dr. Adrian, how do you find the concept of karma relating to psychology?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. So I feel like in psychology we talk a lot about conditioning, like certain things happening in the past kind of emerge again and again in the present moment, and that determines our experience. And there's a cycle of conditioning which keeps on going on into the future. And some people equate karma also to trauma itself. So when I spoke before about, when a trauma happens, even if it's only very subtle or little trauma, it's like there's an aspect of our energy that gets frozen in time, which won't really be resolved until we go back and heal that trauma. So that trauma can be like a source for this continuous spiral into like a traumatic type of response, which kind of, I guess in my view, both of those would equate to like a more gross or obvious level of karma. But of course, in Buddhism, there's also more subtle levels of karma, which I think the psychology hasn't really kind of explored in that much depth. And, in Kalachakra, we talk about the collective karma. We talk about, how these different realms of experience are created through karma. So, a little bit in psychology to do with the collective unconscious, and how, different realms of experience emerge and different people kind of join together based on similar karmic vision. But really, it's a little bit simple understanding at this stage in psychology, and that's something which I think would be a very interesting area to explore in more depth. Thank
you. So we are almost to the end of our discussion today. Adrian, or Dr. Adrian will pop up a couple of slides that you've put together, but just as a talking point, I understand that you'll be offering an online program soon called Hope Awareness Coaching. can you tell everyone a little bit more about this while we bring the slides in, please?
Yeah, so this really grew out of one of the Dzokden retreats in last year, the Golden Age retreat, where we talked a little bit about this incredible vision of a golden age and what can we do given our own experience. How can we contribute to this manifesting? So it really moved through me to bring together and integrate Kalachakra with psychology to really make it available for, I guess, a wider audience and connect them to this profound way of seeing things, this profound image. And so what I've kind of proposing is kind of these group gatherings, which I've called Hope Awareness Coaching. And Hope, H-O-P-E, stands for Healing Our Planet Earth. And what we know more and more is that what is happening outside on our planet, like the wars, the polarizations, the controversies, surrounding the pandemic, for example, the fear that a lot of people hold, what happens on the outside is very much a mirror of what happens on the inside. So, and the other thing in terms of what's going on the planet right now is there's so much technology that we have which can be used for our good. And yet, there just seems to be the need to kind of balance this with developing an inner technology and cultivating our capacity to really do what's needed in a practical way that can make a difference. So what I'm wanting to offer is kind of what I've talked about today, packaged in a really experiential way. Kind of gatherings where we can kind of facilitate healing within ourselves and also collective intention to heal some of the bias, some of the trauma, which is at the root of so many things that are happening at the moment. So where will this begin? So initially, I've got my first online group gathering happening in September, and anyone is welcome to register for that. I'm looking at somewhere between 10 or 25 people perhaps. And then on the website there's the option to connect one-on-one, kind of like if you feel called. And this will then lead to, in February next year, what I'm planning to offer, which is a 3-month online program, which is kind of like a weekly catch-up, which will have a little bit of structure to really delve into more deeply this link between Kalachakra and modern psychology, looking at the Kalachakra view and path in this context. And it's really targeted, I guess, for people with some familiarity in Kalachakra who kind of want to put it in maybe a little bit of a different context to enrich their understanding, and also people who've never heard of Kalachakra who just want to be with this idea of gathering in this way to really come together and heal our own trauma and have the intention of healing greater trauma, which is all around us. So what we're going to cover is guided meditations in a very interactive way to really cultivate this, what they call in Kalachakra warrior compassion. So it'll help increase our capacity to make a difference and become agents for change, so that we can really become responsible or able to respond to what's going on in the world. I'm also hoping, I guess, to begin a dialogue with people who may have a bit of a similar background to my own and who could also possibly the prospective mentors themselves to spread this work a bit further afield. So in my last slide, it has the contact details. Could we put the last slide up, if that's possible?
No problem. We also have one more question when you finish.
Oh, okay.
That would be good to cover. You want to do that first?
Yeah, let's do the question.
Okay, perfect. In case you have actually come into contact with, for people with, I guess, secular psychological problems or suffering, would it be better to help people in the name of Buddhism as a religion, or to put on a secular cloak and use the connotation of Buddhism to enlighten and help them more? Well, what are your sort of thoughts or views with that?
Yeah, I really love that question. I think from my perspective, it's really about being available and fully present to exactly where they're at. And if they come from a place where they've got some kind of Buddhist background, then by all means we can speak in that language if we're connecting in that way. But if they don't happen to have that Buddhist background, then I think really whatever flows in that space of being available, being there with them with love, is I think what's needed. And then, like, the language that we use in psychology, I think can be very.
Thank you. I hope that answers that question for that person. So we'll pop up your last slide, Adrian, about your Hope Awareness program. So the first link there is the details of Dr. Adrian's Hope Awareness program.
Yeah, so I really hope that if some parts of this presentation have touched you, that you may be interested in sharing this further afield. You may be interested in checking out the website, and in particular some of the details of the program a little bit more. Perhaps we could put the link into the chat for people. And also on this other slide, just to summarise a little bit about where we've gone in this journey to explore psychology through this lens of Kalachakra. I've written down some references for some of the major areas of psychology which I use day to day in my work and find can be really, really helpful for people to check out. So we've got these different waves of psychology: the cognitive wave, mindful self-compassion, positive psychology, internal family systems, the comprehensive resource model. And I really encourage you, if you think something of what I've said has struck a chord, to go and explore a little further and see what may come out of that.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Adrian. Are there any sort of closing thoughts from you or anything else that you would like to touch on?
Yeah, so I guess firstly a big thanks to you, Tanya, to Chloe and the team at Rime, and especially to Khentrul Rinpoche as well. For we had a conversation back when I visited Melbourne in early May this year, and I was really, really nervous. I was like, okay, I was presenting him what I wanted to do, and I was kind of like, oh, I just hope I'm not diluting things. I hope I'm kind of on the right track. And he was just so really beautifully supportive about this idea of integrating psychology and Kalachakra, and I really thank him for that, and also thank him as my connection to this beautiful Tibetan Buddhist tradition and lineage. So also like to thank some of my own mentors, Kelly Blazer, who runs a program called Dharma Bridge, which brings together Buddhism and psychology, and also Dr. Putek Chan, especially my beautiful partner Lee for being such an awesome promotions officer and being so supportive leading up to this. And just in terms of something to take home, I guess I really see the essence of Kalachakra in a practical way, to be this inner calling to open our heart to love, compassion, kindness. And this can really be a door to unveiling our sacred truth, our enlightened reality. I see this being very, very similar as we see the evolution of psychology. Nowadays, it's not so much what's wrong with you, it's about what happened to you, and it's about how we can be a loving and compassionate witness to what happened and how that can lead to this discovery of this deeper reality within us. There's a beautiful quote, which I think is by a man called Thomas Hubel, which I might finish off with. We can only move towards an authentic future when we are done recreating our past. This is why what we know about trauma healing is so important, because when this beautiful vision towards a golden age and manifesting this vision of Shambhala, it's kind of difficult if we really don't go to those dark, awful places where healing needs to happen both within ourselves and both collectively and on our planet. So I guess to finish, I'd really like to dedicate this talk to the flourishing of this beautiful project, the land of Shambhala, and really towards part of this vision, helping those who are interested in developing community or sangha with this special interest of integrating Kalachakra and psychology. So thank you again.
Thank you, Dr. Adrian, for sharing your thoughts and wisdom with us tonight. We really appreciate it. Just in closing from this side, I hope that this talk has, allows people to find ways to give back in their professions and be able to look at things in their daily lives in a different way. As Adrian touched on, a Golden Age retreat that we did have. We will have more of these retreats coming in 2022 as well. The next talk of the Land of Shambhala Holistic Living series will happen next month. That will be Sunday, the 12th of September, and that will be available on Zoom and also on Facebook. And we are very fortunate to have Tulku Lobsang Rinpoche and Khentrul Rinpoche talking about the Kalachakra yoga practice and working with the subtle body. So don't miss that one. In closing again, thank you very much, Adrian. Thank you to our translators, and thank you for everyone for listening tonight.